Forget what the movies taught you about Wild West gunfighting. Those hip-shooting showdowns where lawmen blazed away from the waist and somehow hit targets at 50 yards. Pure fantasy. The real frontier marshals who survived long enough to earn a reputation mastered precision techniques, so effective, so carefully guarded, that most of them died with the men who perfected them. Today, we're resurrecting 12 of those hidden firing tricks, the real methods that let Tin Star legends hit targets when missing meant dying. Number 12. The respiratory pause. Picture yourself facing an armed outlaw at 70 yards with nothing but a Colt peacemaker. Your heart is hammering against your ribs. Your hands want to shake no matter how hard you try to steady them. Sweat is sliding down your temple, and every instinct screams to pull that trigger fast before he gets his shot off first. But the lawmen who survived these encounters knew something that separated them from the men who ended up in unmarked graves on the edge of town. They understood that the human body betrays the shooter with every breath and every heartbeat, and that mastering those biological rhythms was worth more than the fastest draw in the territory. The respiratory pause was a technique borrowed from military sharpshooters and refined through hard experience on the frontier. The principle was devastatingly simple. Between the exhale and the next inhale exists a moment of natural stillness, a window of roughly 2 to 3 seconds where the chest stops moving and the body reaches its most stable state. The diaphragm relaxes. The ribcage settles. For that brief moment, the shooter becomes as close to a stationary platform as human anatomy allows. Experienced lawmen train themselves to recognize this pause instinctively and to break their shots only within that narrow window, never before and never after. But it went deeper than just breathing. The truly skilled shooters synchronized their trigger press with the space between heartbeats. The pulse sends tiny vibrations through the body, imperceptible in normal life, but magnified enormously when you're trying to hold a 3-pound revolver steady on a distant target. Each cardiac contraction creates a micro-tremor that travels through the chest, down the arms, and into the hands. By timing the shot to fall between those cardiac pulses, a lawman could eliminate another source of involuntary movement that his opponent likely never even knew existed. Pat Garrett, the man who killed Billy the Kid, was known to take an almost meditative approach before difficult shots. Witnesses described him standing motionless, breathing slowly and deliberately, then suddenly firing with uncanny accuracy that seemed impossible for the distance involved. What looked like supernatural calm was actually a disciplined application of respiratory control that he'd practiced thousands of times until it became pure instinct. The technique required patience that went against every survival instinct hardwired into the human brain. While your opponent might be raising his weapon, while your mind screamed that you were about to die, you had to trust the process, find your pause, and let the shot break clean. Panic pulled triggers. Discipline won gunfights. Those who mastered the respiratory pause discovered they could stretch the effective range of a revolver by 20 or 30 yards, turning a 50-yard gamble into a 70-yard certainty. Those who couldn't master it, who let fear override their training and jerked the trigger between breaths, rarely got a second chance to learn from their mistake. Number 11. The post brace. When Hollywood shows a lawman drawing down on an outlaw, he's almost always standing in the open, unsupported, relying on nothing but steady nerves and raw courage. The real frontier marshals would have called that suicide. They understood a fundamental truth about long-range pistol shooting that dime novels never mentioned. The human body makes a terrible shooting platform, and anything that could reduce that instability was worth using, no matter how it looked to bystanders. The post brace turned the frontier environment itself into a marksmanship aid. Fence posts, door frames, wagon wheels, porch columns, hitching rails, even tree trunks became improvised shooting rests. The technique varied depending on what was available, but the principle remained constant. Get something solid between your body and the target, and let that object absorb the tremors your muscles couldn't eliminate on their own. For vertical supports like fence posts, lawmen would press the shooting hand's wrist firmly against the wood, while keeping the revolver clear of direct contact. This created a stable pivot point without affecting the weapon's function, or risking a malfunction from debris. Some refined the technique further, wrapping the support arm completely around the post and gripping their own shooting wrist, essentially turning themselves into a human tripod locked against an immovable object. The result was handgun stability that approached what most shooters could only achieve with a rifle. Horizontal surfaces offered different advantages entirely. A wagon bed, a windowsill, a water trough, or even a stack of feed sacks could support the entire forearm, creating almost rifle-like stability from a standard revolver. Experienced lawmen learned to scan any environment for potential bracing points the moment they arrived, mentally mapping out shooting positions before trouble ever started. By the time confrontation came, they already knew exactly where to move. The legendary Marshal Bill Tillman was known to position himself near structural supports whenever he entered a saloon or confronted suspects in the street. What appeared to casual observers as relaxed positioning was actually tactical preparation, ensuring that if gunfire erupted, he'd have an instant advantage in accuracy over anyone foolish enough to try shooting unsupported. This wasn't cowardice or trickery, it was professionalism. The men who survived hundreds of frontier confrontations didn't believe in fair fights. They believed in winning. Number 10. Kentucky windage. Before adjustable sights became common on handguns, frontier shooters faced a serious problem. Fixed sights were regulated at the factory for a specific distance, usually around 15 to 25 yards for revolvers. Beyond that range, bullets dropped predictably. Factor in a crosswind, and hitting a man-sized target at 60 yards became nearly impossible using the sights as intended. The solution was Kentucky windage, a mental calculation system that transformed those fixed sights into surprisingly flexible aiming tools. The name came from frontier riflemen who'd perfected the technique generations earlier, but lawmen adapted it for shorter-range combat with handguns. The system required shooters to know their weapons intimately. How much did the bullet drop at 40 yards? 50? 70? They'd spend hours on practice ranges, firing at measured distances and memorizing exactly where to hold the front sight to compensate. A revolver shooting 3 inches low at 50 yards meant holding the sight picture 3 inches high. The mental adjustment became automatic. Wind compensation was trickier. Lawmen learned to read grass movement, dust patterns, and flag behavior to estimate crosswind speed. A 10-mile-per-hour crosswind might push a .45 caliber bullet 2 inches left over 50 yards. Experienced shooters would aim 2 inches right, letting the wind carry the round into their target. Some lawmen scratched reference marks into their revolver frames, tiny notches that corresponded to specific distances. Others used the width of the front sight blade as a measuring unit. At 50 yards, holding one blade width high. At 75, 2 widths. These personalized systems weren't written down. They existed only in the muscle memory and mental calculations of individual shooters. Wyatt Earp demonstrated Kentucky windage mastery during the infamous buntline special shots attributed to him. Whether those specific stories were true or embellished, the underlying technique was absolutely real and widely practiced by serious frontier marksmen. Number 9. The Hasty sling wrap. While revolver tricks dominated close-range encounters, lawmen pursuing criminals across open country relied heavily on rifles and carbines. The Winchester 1873 and its successors were accurate weapons, but their potential was wasted without proper stabilization. The Hasty sling wrap was the field technique that turned a good rifle into a precision instrument. Unlike modern shooting slings with their quick-adjust mechanisms, frontier rifle slings were simple leather straps, primarily designed for carrying. Creative shooters discovered they could transform these carrying straps into powerful accuracy aids with a specific wrapping technique. The Hasty wrap involved threading the support arm through the sling, looping it around the forearm and pulling tension against the rifle's forend. When executed correctly, the sling created a bone-to-leather-to-rifle connection that eliminated most arm tremor. The support arm essentially became a rigid extension of the weapon, controlled by skeletal structure rather than fatiguing muscles. Deputy marshals riding into unfamiliar territory would pre-configure their slings before approaching a suspected hideout. The wrap took only seconds to execute, but those seconds could mean the difference between a clean hit at 150 yards and a miss that gave the outlaw time to escape or return fire. The technique required practice to master. Wrap the sling too tight and blood flow to the hand was restricted, causing numbness. Too loose and the stabilization benefit disappeared. Experienced shooters found their personal sweet spot through repetition, adjusting for different shooting positions and environmental conditions. During the pursuit of the Dalton Gang in 1892, several marshals were noted for their ability to deliver accurate rifle fire while dismounted in open prairie. The Hasty sling wrap transformed their Winchesters into weapons capable of engaging targets at ranges that should have been impossible for snap shooting. If you're learning something the history books left out, that subscribe button helps us keep digging up these forgotten frontier techniques. Number 8. Trigger staging. Most people assume a trigger pull is a single motion. Squeeze until the gun fires and hope for the best. But lawmen who needed surgical precision at distance understood something that casual shooters never learned. Trigger manipulation was actually a two-stage process that could be exploited for dramatically improved accuracy, and mastering it separated the professionals from the men who simply owned guns. Every single-action revolver has what shooters call slack, a small amount of trigger travel before the mechanism begins to engage the hammer. The trigger moves, but nothing happens mechanically. It's dead space built into the design. Beyond the slack lies the break point, the critical threshold where the sear releases and the hammer falls. Most shooters blast through both stages in one convulsive squeeze, introducing movement and disruption at the worst possible moment. The staging technique separated these phases intentionally, turning a liability into an advantage. During the aiming process, skilled shooters would take up the slack first, pressing the trigger slowly and deliberately just to the edge of the breakpoint and holding it there. The hammer was cocked. The sear was engaged. The entire mechanism sat poised at the edge of discharge, waiting for the final command. This eliminated one entire source of movement from the final firing sequence. When the sights aligned perfectly on the target, only a few ounces of additional pressure were needed to fire the shot, far less movement than a full trigger pull would require. The gun essentially fired itself the moment the shooter decided to let it. The technique demanded intimate knowledge of individual weapons. Each Colt, each Smith & Wesson, each Remington had different trigger characteristics. Breakpoints varied in weight and feel. Some triggers stacked pressure gradually before releasing. Others broke clean, like glass snapping. A lawman might own a revolver for years, learning its exact breakpoint through thousands of dry-fire repetitions until he could stage the trigger with unconscious precision. The weapon became an extension of his nervous system, responding to intention rather than mechanical input. James Butler Hickok, better known as Wild Bill, was observed holding his revolvers with fingers wrapped differently than casual shooters typically displayed. Some historians believe he was pre-staging triggers during his famous two-gun displays, maintaining both weapons at the edge of firing while he calmly assessed threats and selected targets. What audiences interpreted as theatrical showmanship was likely deadly serious technique, keeping his revolvers ready to discharge the instant his decision was made. The danger was obvious and unavoidable. A staged trigger sits fractions of a millimeter from discharge. Startle the shooter unexpectedly, bump his arm in a crowd, let his concentration slip for a single moment, and the gun fires unintentionally. Men died from staged triggers that broke at the wrong time. This is precisely why trigger staging remained a technique for experienced professionals, never taught to casual gun owners or green deputies still learning their craft. The lawmen who used it accepted the risk with clear eyes because the accuracy benefit at distance made it worthwhile. In a world where missing meant dying, A dangerous edge was better than no edge at all. Number 7. The elbow lock. Muscle tremor is the enemy of precision shooting. No matter how steady your nerves, the fibers in your arms and hands are constantly making micro-adjustments, tiny movements invisible to the eye, but catastrophic to accuracy at distance. Frontier lawmen developed the elbow lock to circumvent this biological limitation entirely. The technique relied on skeletal support rather than muscular strength. By positioning the arms so that joints locked into their natural stops, shooters could create a stable platform supported by bone rather than muscle. Bones don't tremble. Bones don't fatigue. Bones simply hold position until deliberately moved. For revolver shooting, the elbow lock involved extending the shooting arm fully while pulling the elbow of the support arm tight against the rib cage. This created a triangular structure where the support arm's bones bore most of the weapon's weight, transferring stress away from the muscles that would otherwise be fighting gravity and tremor. The position looked awkward compared to the bent arm stance Hollywood favors. But appearance didn't matter on the frontier. Results did. And lawmen who adopted the elbow lock found they could hold a sight picture steady for much longer periods, giving them precious extra seconds to time their shots with respiratory pauses and trigger staging. Dallas Staudenmeier, city marshal of El Paso in 1881, killed 4 men in 5 seconds during a street fight that became frontier legend. Witnesses described his shooting stance as stiff and mechanical, unlike the fluid movements of exhibition shooters. What they were likely observing was a man applying elbow lock principles under extreme stress, relying on skeletal structure when adrenaline would have made muscular control impossible. The technique's limitation was mobility. Locked joints don't transition quickly to new targets, but for the deliberate long-range shot where accuracy trumped speed, the elbow lock gave lawmen an edge their opponents rarely expected. Number 6. The saddle horn rest. Mounted lawmen faced unique challenges that ground-based shooters never had to consider. Chasing criminals across open country, they often needed to make shots from horseback at distances that would challenge even a standing shooter on solid ground. The horse was constantly moving beneath them. The terrain was unpredictable. Dust filled their eyes and wind whipped past their ears. Yet dismounting wasn't an option. Those precious seconds spent swinging down from the saddle gave fleeing outlaws exactly the head start they needed to vanish over the next ridge. The solution wasn't abandoning the horse. It was turning the saddle itself into a shooting platform. The saddle horn rest transformed the pommel into an improvised bench rest that moved with the rider. A lawman would cross his shooting arm over the horn, pressing the forearm firmly against the leather while gripping the revolver or rifle with practiced steadiness. The horse's body absorbed much of the remaining movement, acting as a living shock absorber beneath the shooter. The rigid pommel provided a stable pivot point that approximated the kind of support a standing shooter might find bracing against a fence post or windowsill. It wasn't perfect stability, but it was dramatically better than trying to shoot one-handed while bouncing across the prairie. This technique required a calm, well-trained horse above all else. Animals that startled at gunfire, that spooked at muzzle flash, or that fought the reins during tense moments would destroy any stability the position offered. Experienced lawmen invested heavily in horses specifically bred and trained for the chaos of mounted gunfighting. They spent months conditioning these animals to remain steady through repeated shots fired from the saddle. A good gun horse was worth more than the weapons themselves, and lawmen who found one guarded that animal jealously. For rifle shots, some lawmen carried specialized saddle scabbards angled to permit quick draws directly into the saddle horn position. The rifle would come free from the leather, cross smoothly over the pommel, and the shooter could be on target before a dismounted opponent had finished stepping down from his stirrups. The entire sequence took seconds when properly rehearsed. Captain John Hughes of the Texas Rangers was famous for his mounted accuracy, reportedly making kills at over 100 yards while still in the saddle. What looked like miraculous shooting was actually systematic application of the saddle horn rest, turning his horse into a mobile shooting platform through years of dedicated practice. The technique's drawback was vulnerability. A man locked into the saddle horn position couldn't maneuver his horse effectively or respond to unexpected threats from other directions. If the shot missed, he was momentarily defenseless. But in pursuit situations where the fleeing outlaw was focused entirely on escape rather than returning fire, the saddle horn rest offered accuracy that justified the calculated risk. Number 5. The prone drop standing is the worst position for precision shooting. Every part of the body is working against gravity, muscles straining, blood pumping, tiny corrections happening constantly. Frontier lawmen learned that when distance demanded maximum accuracy and cover was unavailable, the ground itself became their greatest ally. The prone drop was a dramatic commitment. The shooter literally threw himself to the earth, landing in a stable firing position with the weapon already tracking the target. What looked reckless was actually calculated. The moment of falling was faster than any standing adjustment, and the position achieved offered stability that standing could never match. In the prone position, both elbows planted firmly, the entire skeletal structure became a shooting platform. Tremor virtually disappeared. The weapon's weight rested on the ground rather than fatiguing arm muscles. Breathing effects were minimized because the rifle or revolver moved with the chest rather than being suspended above it. Lawmen practiced the drop until it became reflexive. The key was maintaining situational awareness during the transition. Eyes stayed on target. Hands kept the weapon oriented correctly. The fall itself was controlled, landing on forearms and distributing impact to avoid jarring the shooting position. During the infamous Ingalls Raid of 1893, Deputy Marshal Jim Masterson took a prone position behind a slight rise and delivered accurate Winchester fire at outlaws who assumed they were beyond effective handgun range. His position made him nearly invisible while allowing shots that would have been impossible standing. The technique's weakness was obvious. Prone shooters couldn't relocate quickly if flanked, and rising from prone under fire was extremely dangerous. Lawmen used the drop for specific situations, ideal for open country pursuits or when facing a barricaded suspect at known range. It was never a default stance, but when conditions aligned, nothing matched its stability. Number 4. The two-hand hold. Walk into any modern shooting range, and you'll see shooters gripping handguns with both hands wrapped around the frame. This technique is so universal today that most people assume it was always standard practice. It wasn't. On the frontier, one-handed shooting was the norm, and the two-hand hold was considered an eccentric technique used only by dedicated accuracy specialists. The physics were undeniable. Two hands on a revolver effectively doubled the points of contact, spread the weapon's recoil across more muscle groups, and created a far more rigid aiming platform than a single hand could achieve. Every serious lawman who experimented with the technique discovered immediate accuracy improvements, especially at extended distances. So why wasn't everyone using it? Cultural expectations played a role. One-handed shooting looked professional and competent. The two-hand grip appeared desperate, something a man would do only if he lacked confidence in his abilities. Lawmen who cared about their reputations hesitated to adopt a stance that might invite ridicule. The men who ignored fashion and focused on results discovered significant advantages. The two-hand hold allowed for faster sight acquisition, better recoil control for follow-up shots, and sustained accuracy during the stress of actual gunfights when fine motor control was compromised by adrenaline. Elfigo Baca, the legendary New Mexico lawman who survived an 1884 gunfight against 80 attackers, reportedly used a two-hand grip during the extended siege. His ability to place accurate fire through small windows and door gaps while vastly outnumbered suggests he prioritized precision over appearance. The two-hand hold would eventually become standard in the 20th century, validated by military and law enforcement professionals worldwide. But on the frontier, it remained a semi-secret technique known primarily to shooters who valued survival over reputation. Number 3. The filed front sight factory sights on frontier revolvers were compromises. Manufacturers produced weapons for the average shooter in average conditions, regulated for average distances. But serious lawmen weren't average, and their shooting conditions varied wildly. The filed front sight was a customization technique that matched a weapon's point of aim to its specific owner's requirements. Every shooter has unique characteristics: eye dominance, preferred range, grip pressure, trigger pull style. All these factors affect where bullets actually strike relative to where the sights appear to point. Factory settings might work acceptably for one man and deliver shots 3 inches off point for another. The solution was permanent sight modification. Using needle files, Lawmen would carefully reshape front sight blades to correct individual aiming errors. Shooting high, file the front sight taller, shooting left, remove material from the right side of the blade. The process was painstaking and irreversible, but the results were custom weapons that shot exactly where their owners aimed. Some lawmen went further, adding personal reference marks or widening sight notches for faster acquisition in low light. These modifications weren't just cosmetic. They represented hundreds of rounds of testing, careful measurement of group placement, and gradual refinement until the weapon became an extension of the shooter's intentions. Bat Masterson was known to carry personally modified Colts that outside observers found peculiar. The sights didn't look factory. The balance seemed altered. But in Masterson's hands, those weapons delivered accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. What casual observers attributed to talent was partly the result of meticulous customization. The filed front sight tradition continues today among competitive shooters, but its frontier origins are largely forgotten. Every time a modern gunsmith adjusts sights for a client, they're following a tradition established by lawmen who understood that generic equipment couldn't deliver personal excellence. Number 2. The cold bore ritual. The first shot from any firearm behaves differently than subsequent shots. Barrel temperature, residue buildup, and metal expansion all affect ballistics in ways that become consistent only after the weapon has been fired several times. Frontier lawmen called this phenomenon cold bore shift, and understanding it separated professionals from amateurs. A revolver sitting in a holster all morning has a barrel at ambient temperature. Metal contracts slightly in cold conditions, affecting the bore diameter that the bullet must travel. The first shot might print 2 inches differently than the 10th shot from the same weapon, aimed at the same point. In a life or death situation, 2 inches could mean the difference between a center hit and a wounding graze. Experienced lawmen developed cold bore rituals to manage this variability. Some would fire a single round each morning before going on duty, warming the barrel and establishing their weapon's hot baseline. Others simply memorized their specific gun's cold bore shift and compensated their aim accordingly for that critical first shot. The technique required detailed record keeping. Shooters would document where their cold bore shots landed versus their warmed-up groups, often discovering consistent patterns. One weapon might throw cold shots slightly high and right. Another might impact dead-on but keyhole due to reduced barrel pressure. Each gun was individual. Marshal Chris Madsen, one of the 3 guardsmen of Oklahoma Territory, reportedly insisted on firing his duty weapon each morning before patrol. Fellow lawmen initially thought this was superstition until they noticed Madsen's remarkable first shot accuracy in actual confrontations. He wasn't lucky, he was prepared. Understanding cold bore behavior also affected weapon storage and carry decisions. A revolver worn against the body would warm from contact, changing its characteristics from a holster-stored weapon. Lawmen who rotated between belt and pocket carry learned to track these variations. Number 1. The dead man's eye. Every technique we've discussed, the respiratory pause, the bracing methods, the trigger staging, all of them can be learned through practice and repetition. But the difference between a competent shooter and a genuine frontier legend came down to something harder to teach: the mental state that allowed perfect execution under the ultimate pressure of facing armed men who wanted to kill you. Lawmen called it the dead man's eye. It was the ability to achieve complete focus while simultaneously detaching from the emotional weight of the moment. To see only the front sight, hear only your own breathing, feel only the trigger, while another human being was actively trying to end your existence. Those who mastered it described the experience as stepping outside themselves, watching their own actions from a calm distance while their body performed the mechanics of shooting with perfect precision. The technique wasn't unique to the frontier. Military snipers, competitive athletes, and combat pilots have described similar dissociative states under extreme stress, but frontier lawmen developed it independently through accumulated gunfight experience that either killed them or taught them to control their minds under fire. Training for the dead man's eye was informal but deliberate. Experienced lawmen would create increasingly stressful practice scenarios for younger officers, firing near them, shouting distractions, creating chaos, all while demanding accurate shooting. The goal was inoculation against stress, building tolerance until gunfire no longer triggered panic responses. Visualization played a role as well. Many documented lawmen describe mentally rehearsing gunfights before they happened, imagining specific scenarios and their own responses with vivid detail. When real confrontations matched their mental preparations, their responses came automatically, without the hesitation that got other men killed. Wild Bill Hickok's famous calm under fire wasn't mythological. Observers consistently noted his almost preternatural stillness in gunfights, a complete absence of the trembling and rushing that characterized his opponents. What they witnessed was the dead man's eye in full effect, a mental state that allowed his considerable physical skills to perform without interference from fear. The dead man's eye couldn't be purchased or inherited. It could only be earned through confrontation with mortality and the deliberate cultivation of mental control. Some lawmen achieved it after a single gunfight that transformed their psychology. Others never found it despite years of violent experience, but those who possessed it became the legends, whose names survived into history. From respiratory pauses to filed sights, from sling wraps to the dead man's eye, these 12 techniques represented the accumulated wisdom of men who lived by the gun. None of these tricks appeared in dime novels or traveling Wild West shows. They were professional secrets, shared quietly between lawmen who understood that frontier survival demanded more than fast hands and straight shooting. The common thread connecting all 12 techniques was simple: preparation trumps natural talent. The lawmen who survived didn't rely on luck or God-given gifts. They studied their craft obsessively, modified their equipment deliberately, and trained their minds ruthlessly. When gunfights erupted, they weren't improvising. They were executing plans developed through years of methodical preparation. Hollywood replaced this reality with mythology, giving us hip-shooting heroes who blazed away without aiming and somehow hit targets through pure protagonist energy. The real Wild West was far more calculated, far more technical, and far more deadly. These weren't tricks. They were the science of frontier survival, written in gun smoke and leather, tested in encounters where missing meant dying. The men who mastered them became legends. The men who didn't became unmarked graves in forgotten cemeteries across the American frontier.